Hey, what is up, everybody? This is Stevie Breach coming to you tonight. A new show debuted on the WWE Network, which was called Legends, with JBL. This was episode 1. It was an in-depth interview with Eric Bischoff. And honestly, I will tell you, when I first fired up the WWE Network and I pressed on the little thumbnail to make the video start playing, and I looked down and I noticed that this was a 50-minute episode, my stomach turned a little bit. But I will tell you honestly that words cannot describe how great this show is. I mean, I've read Eric Bischoff's book. I've read Eric Bischoff's Wikipedia page. I've listened to Eric Bischoff on the Stone Cold Steve Austin podcast more than a few times. And I think he's even been a guest on the Chris Jericho podcast, even though I'm not 100% sure of that one. But I've heard the Eric Bischoff story, a lot. I mean, I watched all the episodes of the Monday Night War series. I've seen the 2002 interview with Eric Bischoff in front of the Monday Night Raw set that you see on all of the WWE documentaries over the years. I've seen just about everything, but I will tell you what puts this over the top is JBL. JBL is an excellent host. I think, honestly, you fire up this on the WWE Network out of the on-demand section. You listened to his, 30 to 45 second promo talking about the show and introducing Eric Bischoff. You will see how good of a host JBL is, and see that the character that he portrays on Monday Night Raw on the announce team just does not give any credit to JBL. I know that JBL has done real television work for Fox News, being the sort of money and stockbroker kind of talk guy. So he is a real professional television host, but I honestly can say that I was really surprised. I got a tweet from somebody today talking about my preview video for the JBL show. When I talked about the fact that JBL hadn't done any podcasts, they were able to tell me that JBL was a guest on the Chris Jericho podcast. I think there was a while when I didn't notice that I wasn't subscribed to the Chris Jericho podcast, but I'm able now to go back into the on-demand section of the Jericho podcast and pull that one up. I can guarantee you that that's going to be a really good one. This was a great show. Like I said, I mean, if you've read Bischoff's book, if you've read, Bischoff's Wikipedia page, if you know anything about Eric Bischoff, you know his story. But the conversation that JBL has with Eric Bischoff was great. It's a lot along the likes of like a podcast would be, but it's sort of like with a 3 to 4 camera setup, with them bouncing all around. I'm guessing that more than likely they're filming Eric Bischoff sort of straight on without JBL in there, and I'm guessing that they're feeding him some questions that they can cut out and put into documentaries somewhere along the way, whether if they have more WCW docs or they talk about certain wrestlers or certain things that pop up, or even use this on like WWE Countdown or on the list. Just getting a quick clip and able to put it in there. The WWE will be able to use this interview 1,000 different ways and only have to pay Bischoff the one-time fee to make this guy come in here. Very smart on their part. But Bischoff talks about basically, growing up, being a wrestling fan, bouncing around from job to job, and then, realizing that when he got married and he was expecting his first child, that he needed to get a real job. He talked about the fact that he was in a wrestling tournament and he was trying to sell to Vern Gagne, the AWA, sort of a way to publicize it and get more tickets sold for the event. Vern Gagne learned who he was. Then, this is something that I did not know, and if I knew, I had forgotten. But very early in his life, Eric Bischoff and Sonny Ono, yes, Sonny Ono of WCW managerial fame, went into business with each other as being friends. They bought and produced and sold a Ninja Star Wars game where basically, Sonny Ono talked about growing up in Tokyo, talking about getting Coke bottle caps and throwing them at friends, playing tag with each other. Eric Bischoff talked about living in Detroit, and they would play Army, where their version of tag was basically throwing rocks at each other. And they basically, made this game where they would make and produce these ninja stars that they sold, and the kids would buy them, and they would fling them at each other all around the house, and they would be tons of fun. So they made this game. They were able to, I think they said they produced it in Korea, and they shipped him over all these games to sell. And Bischoff at this point didn't really know what he was going to do, but he went back to Vern Gagne and the AWA. They set up sort of a business relationship between the two, where it would be like a 50-50 split. They would use Vern Gagne's AWA television in order to sell these games with an 800 number, and Bischoff would be able to sell his game. Vern Gagne would be able to collect 50% of the profits, and all he would have to do is give up the commercial time for people to sell this. Through this, basically, Bischoff was brought into the AWA in the sales department, and basically when an announcer quit one day or was fired, he was the one guy that was standing there that was wearing a suit, so they plugged him onto television to do the one day that they needed. And then basically they kept on bringing in announcers and firing the announcers to the point where they said, it's going to be a lot cheaper and probably take up a lot less time if we just teach Bischoff how to do this. And he ended up becoming an announcer himself. They bring up the fact that he went and, I guess you can say auditioned, tried out in front of Vince McMahon to be a WWF announcer once the AWA was pretty much on its way down. He ended up not getting the job. One thing leads to another. He ends up down in WCW as sort of like the last ranked announcer. He was the announcer of like the backstage announcer on pay-per-views, and he would be like the lead announcer on like the D or the E show way down on the bottom, just sort of getting a role in there. And then basically WCW got to the point where they were tired of losing money, and they were looking for anything fresh and anything new, and Eric Bischoff threw his name into the hat, where basically they took him and they made him president of the company. And you would think of like, when Jim Ross would leave WCW and go to WWE, how much power he would get, basically being the guy that's in charge of what's the title that Johnny Ace or Jim Ross had? They're the talent relations, I guess you can say. And the fact that he wouldn't get this job, I guess what WCW was looking for was just somebody that was not a wrestling person, not a guy in the wrestling business. Bischoff was enough removed that they ended up giving him the job. They'd say that Jim Ross was very jealous. He was thinking that he was going to live up to the reputation of the guy that sort of made him in Jim Herd. And there was a lot of heat between Bischoff and Jim Ross about the fact that he didn't get this job. One thing leads to another. There's debates whether if Eric Bischoff fired Jim Ross or if Jim Ross quit. Basically, Eric Bischoff sort of pats himself on the back, saying that the people inside WCW wanted to move Jim Ross to sales, and at that point he knew that Jim Ross was not going to be happy in the sales department, and he was just going to drive a lot of people crazy. And he basically told Jim, if you have another offer, if there's something else you'd like to do, you're more than free to go and take the offer. He does not take that as him firing Jim Ross. It sort of is saying if there's an opportunity out there, go take it, because we don't really need you here, is the way that he sort of put it. So it's patting himself on the back, not say that he did it, but within getting that job, he found ways of costing a lot of money. Basically, one of the things that he was looked at as a guy that was crazy was he partnered up with Disney in order to use the Disney parks in order to shoot the WCW shows. Basically, they would go out touring, whether if it was for television, whether if it was for a pay-per-view, and they would end up having to paper the crowds. A lot of towns, they would only be able to sell 200 to 300 tickets, and they'd be losing a lot of money. And for years, WCW would say, like, hey, every time we leave to go out on tour, we lose money, so we're going to go do more touring. And Bischoff basically said that does not make sense. We'll go here, we'll use the Disney park, we'll be able to use fresh people that are walking around the Disney parks that want to see a live television show being filmed. They don't care if it's a wrestling show. All they basically want to do is see something being filmed that might be on television and be able to go and do that. And he said the wrestlers really didn't like it because it took away their touring dates and things like that. But within a year, Eric Bischoff turned around WCW to the point where it was making $40 million, where it lost $10 million the previous year before. JBL, being a real money guy, was asking questions if anybody in the Turner company thought of like, hey, that's a pretty big deal for anybody in business to be able to do that. It doesn't matter if you're in the wrestling business or if you're selling T-shirts or anything you're doing. Being able to turn around a business like that, you got to be thinking that this person has big ideas. Why did they never think of putting you into another job instead of another company? Where Bischoff talks about the fact that he just wasn't a corporate guy. He was a guy more that wore T-shirt and jeans, cowboy boots, didn't like to shave. He rode his Harley to work, and people inside of Turner wanted to act as if WCW and the wrestling business never really happened. This was the first part of the interview. They talk about the rise of WCW. The second part is going to be a lot about the fall of WCW, talking about him going and working for WWE. And on the trailer at the very end, they ask him like, do you want another shot? Do you want to get back into the wrestling business? I really want to hear that answer. I know that I'm going to listen to part 2. Main reason I make this video is trying to get people fired up to go watch the video themselves on the WWE network. But it was a really good one, and I'm really sitting here wondering what's going to happen, because with the problems going on in TNA, I don't think that Dixie Carter would go back to Eric Bischoff. I don't even think Eric Bischoff would go back to TNA. But I don't really know where else he could go. I don't think Vince, Triple H, is going to put him in any sort of power, but I would love to see if he would want that power back. Hey, what is up, everybody? This is Stephen Breach coming to you here with part 2 of the Eric Bischoff on Legends with JBL show. Let me say that at the beginning of this show, honestly, just by the open alone, I'm still blown away by the fact of how great of a host JBL is, and how great it is that the WWE is finally finding a way to show the talents of JBL. I know that he's been a Fox News correspondent and been involved with television, talking about business and stocks and making money and saving money and things like that. But JBL, honestly, is going to be a great acquisition for WWE, finding some way to use him on the WWE network and hopefully use him a lot better than he's used on Monday Night Raw. And honestly, I don't even know if the guy's on SmackDown or not, but they picked up right where they left off with Eric Bischoff talking about WCW, and where they started this interview is basically the tide was starting to sway in the favor of WWE. Basically, they talk about the screw job in Montreal, which was Shawn Michaels beating Bret Hart via Vince McMahon telling the timekeeper to ring the bell, and everything that went down along with that. Basically, Eric Bischoff was signing Bret Hart, and he was bringing him to WCW. The plan with Bret Hart was that he was never going to be used on WCW Monday Nitro. He was going to be strictly to sort of brand WCW Thunder and anchor that show that was going to be on TBS, which I believe was going to be on Thursday, and had a small run on Thursday before being moved to Wednesdays on TBS. But this was something that Ted Turner was adamant about adding more WCW television, trying to focus and bringing in more of the wrestling ratings that were helping TNT, that were now going to be able to help TBS. I think that Thunder was a good idea, honestly, trying to add more television, but in the long run, it basically became a headache for Eric Bischoff. It basically was too much television to try and book and try and write. It's one of the things that I think is hurting WWE as of right now, is having no brand split and having guys that are that are on both shows. Instead of being able to make it a simple storyline last a month, now it's almost like you're having to make it last 2 months, because you have guys like the Rusev versus Ziggler. angle, which is going down with Lana and Summer Rae. The angle started out really good, but in a matter of a couple weeks, of course, you've had some injuries along the way. The storyline isn't what it was a few weeks ago, and I think that's basically because you're immediately having to have somebody react off of what happens on Monday Night Raw. You're immediately having to have that angle put up on SmackDown, and that's sort of the same thing that was going down with Nitro and Thunder at the time. But one of the big things that was going down with Nitro and Thunder was, of course, the WCW contracts. A lot of the contracts were built into how many days they were going to work, and now you're adding another date that these guys have to work. So the contracts ended up being only for half as long as they were supposed to be used, or guys would just have to disappear off of television basically because they didn't have the dates to be used on their contract. Coming out of the screw job, basically WWE got one of the biggest heels of all time in Vince McMahon and the Mr. McMahon character, which really helped launch them as a company, having great storylines of Vince coming out of the announcer's chair, being the owner on television as well as the owner behind the scenes, because for so long, Vince was the guy pulling all the strings and he was the head announcer, but so many people only knew him as the head announcer, and now he was the guy that was going to be going head-to-head with the WCW War, as well as head-to-head against Stone Cold Steve Austin, being champion, and just being the focus of Monday Night Raw with the whole McMahon family and everything that was going along with it. So WCW was getting probably the best wrestler that WWE had. JBL asked a lot of questions. The screw job happened around Thanksgiving time, but you guys didn't use him until late December before the Starrcade pay-per-view. And honestly, in my mind as a wrestling fan, I can remember week after week after week waiting for when Bret Hart was going to debut. If we thought he was going to debut that Monday, the next night after the screw job, he wasn't on that show. We thought for guaranteed he was going to debut the next Monday. And it was like the WCW kept on waiting and waiting and waiting. And I guess Eric Bischoff is saying that they were trying to wait all the way until Thunder debuted. But honestly, as a wrestling fan at this time, in my mind, the way I remember it, it felt like months and months, maybe even like 4 to 5 months. If you were to ask me before this interview how long Bret Hart sat on the sideline before making his WCW debut and trying to get something rolling, over in WCW, Bret Hart was one of the most talked about, the people that were on Team Bret, that, Vince had screwed him out of the championship and kicked him out of the company. They were very loyal to Bret Hart, and they probably would have all switched the channel to see no matter what they could do. And instead, the NWO came out and sang "Oh Canada" as a tip of the hat that Bret was coming to WCW. But why not have them come out and sort of confront the NWO, saying that he wasn't going to be with them? And then he ends up, when he finally does debut, he comes out at Starrcade. He makes sure that Scott Hall loses the match as the special guest referee. So WCW wins that, and it doesn't become WCW NWO Nitro. And then in the main event, I think he came out again as the guy making sure that Sting versus Hogan wasn't going to end that way. And then in the matter of no time, Bret Hart just joins the NWO and is sort of like Hulk Hogan's lackey. He was almost like his manager, coming out during his matches, coming out during his interviews. I know that you want to get this guy exposure and get this guy camera time, but definitely right off the bat, you could tell that Bret Hart really had no plan in WCW. And when they would finally start to get the ball rolling with Bret, there was nothing to get going. Let's see, they talked about so much. They talked about the WCW Monday Night Raw invasion, where DX showed up to Monday Nitro trying to get in. JBL sort of gave a lot of the behind the scene things that I had never heard, basically talking about as they were recording the show, they were constantly flipping out the tape. So that way, if they were confronted and WCW wrestlers, asked for the tape to make sure that it wouldn't be shown on Monday Night Raw, they would have the footage and they would sort of be giving them a dummy tape. Team WWE thought that WCW, once this was starting to be shown on Monday Night Raw, would plan some reverse invasion and send guys over to Monday Night Raw to end the show with another confrontation, that they were responding to the war. And they said it was JBL, Farouk, Ken Shamrock, and there was 2 other guys waiting out in the parking lot, and JBL said that was all they were going to need to take on whoever showed up from WCW. They were the real fighters, the guys that really could go, and they would stand up for their brand and do what they wanted to do. But everyone was really hoping that Haku Meng was going to show up, and they were actually going to be able to see that matchup against Meng versus Ken Shamrock. That was the fight that everybody wanted to see who was the toughest guy, and to see who really was the world's strongest man. And that was one of the things that they were really looking for. I thought that basically, WWE just went into the locker room, and they just went along with the show, showing the invasion. I didn't think they ever had any thoughts about WCW showing up. But for JBL to admit that they went out of the parking lot looking for a fight, hoping that WCW was going to show up, I had never heard that part. With all that Monday Night War documentary, with the WCW versus WWE Monday Night War DVD that came out years ago, somewhere along the way that would have been a great thing to slip into there, and somehow WWE let that get edited out. Eric Bischoff talked about the fact that would he want to come back to the wrestling business, and he says that he doesn't really watch a lot of the wrestling in WWE these days. He likes the fact that he's able to help out and stage and produce interviews. That's one of the things that he thinks he's really good at. But running a day-to-day wrestling business is something that Eric Bischoff has really no thoughts of doing. He doesn't really want to do that. Bischoff doesn't even really watch TV that much. He produces television. He'll watch a television show that's working to try and see what the basis of that show, his clicking is, and try to make it work for his own. But he's not just sitting down and watching television week in and week out. He watches news. He watches documentaries, and that's about it. He had some things to say about Vince Russo that aren't good. He said that Vince Russo is a real charming guy. They talked a little bit about the Bash at the Beach deal, and tried to explain it in his own words about what happened, basically saying that they were setting up an angle where it was supposed to be Hulk Hogan taking the championship from Jeff Jarrett. And the screw job was laid out perfectly the way that it was supposed to, with Jeff Jarrett laying down. Hogan pinned him. They had this awkward moment. Hogan walks out with the championship, and then from there, WCW and Monday Nitro would sort of evolve and bring around a new champion, crowning somebody, and then around October, I don't know if this means it was going to happen at Halloween Havoc, if they're going to do sort of like a Roddy Piper thing where somebody wins the main event, and then Hogan would come out at the end of the show, sort of saying that he was the champion, and they would sort of have this back and forth showdown. This would lead to a Starrcade match. That would be Hogan against the champion, and of course that's what the vice president of I guess that'd be AOL, Time Warner. That's what him and Eric Bischoff sort of agreed to. Eric Bischoff said that he was the guy that had the final say. He didn't really use that against Russo. He didn't want to hold it over his head, but that was the chain of command that was supposed to happen. But instead, Hulk Hogan and Eric Bischoff leave the show. They fly back to Tampa to go to Hogan's house, and immediately once they get off the plane, they both have all these missed calls on their cell phones, basically saying that Russo had gone commando. He'd gone out of the show and basically trashed Hulk Hogan, basically saying that he was never going to be there. They had gone out of their way to crown a new champion in Booker T, having Booker T versus Jeff Jarrett. The Bischoff says that he thinks that Hogan won a lawsuit that was probably $4 to $5 million, based off the fact that Vince Russo went out there on his own and basically trashed the Hulk Hogan character, going against Hulk Hogan's contract with WCW, and it put WCW even more in the hole than it was. So, Legends with JBL, Part 2 with Eric Bischoff really was a great show. Hopefully you guys go out of your way and check this out. I thought it was a really, really great episode, and I'm sure you guys will like it as well.